Welcome to lab number 7 on application deployment. In this lab, you're going to learn how to deploy an application using two different methods. One will be the admin console, and the second method will be using the command line tool WebLogic.deployer. So this lab requires that you deploy all the example code when you installed WebLogic. So in lab 1, when we installed WebLogic, we had the option to specify complete with examples. And so what that did is that it created 3 sample WebLogic domains with associated applications. So there's numerous web applications that came with those example domains. So that's what we're going to use during this lab exercise. So we're going to start with using the admin console to deploy. So go ahead and open up a terminal window. And we're going to deploy a sample application to our demo domain. So first things first, let's go ahead and start the demo domain admin server. Okay, go into demo domain in bin, and then run the start WebLogic script. Okay, so once your admin server's up and running, go ahead and open up your browser. And log into the admin console. So to deploy an application, you do that on the deployments page. So under domain structure on the left-hand side, click on deployments. And you see here on the summary of deployments page on the control tab, there's a table that would list all the deployments for this domain. Right now we have no applications that are deployed to our demo domain. But you see here we have an install button and then update, delete, start, and stop. So we can install an application, we can update an application or a deployment, we can delete it, and we can stop it and start it. So let's go ahead and click the install button. And when you click the install button, the next screen is going to ask you for the deployment files. Now, there's a couple ways we can do this. There's actually 3 ways we can do this. One, you can upload your file via the browser. So if it's not too large and it's not on the admin server, then you can upload it via the browser. And that's this hyperlink right here. You can click on upload your files and you'll get a pop-up window, and you'll locate the EAR or the WAR file, the jar, and upload it that way. The other mechanism is that you can type in the path to your application, or you can browse to it using these links here. So each one of these directory names is a link. This is just like, Windows Explorer or your File Explorer on your operating system. So one of the example domains that was installed with WebLogic contains a sample application that we're going to deploy. And that sample application is located under the application's home directory. Now, refer to the table beginning of the lab guide that defines the application's home directory. So in my environment, application's home is under lab home. So that's U01 Udemy. Click on Udemy and click on applications. And you see under applications that there are 3 subdirectories. There's MedRec, which is the medical records application. There's MedRec Spring, which is the Spring version of that application. And then there's WL Server, which contains a variety of applications. And so the application that we want is actually in this directory. So go ahead and click on this. And then under examples, build. And under build, we see a bunch of different applications here. So as I mentioned in the lecture, you can actually deploy an archive file, or you can deploy an exploded archive directory. So when you're looking at the list of applications here, you'll see some that have this little open directory next to the name of the application. This is an exploded archive. So this WL server directory contains a mix of archive files and exploded archive directories. So for the purposes of this exercise, we're going to deploy an exploded archive directory. Now, the process for deploying an archive directory and an archive file, so the one that we want to deploy is this main web app. So go ahead and check the radio button and click Next. On the next page, we have the ability to deploy this as an application or to deploy it as a library. WebLogic doesn't necessarily know whether or not the application is an application or if it's a shared Java EE library. Sometimes it does, and it will default to the library if the deployment descriptors in the jar file are sufficient. But in this case, let's accept the default, which is install this as an application, and click Next. In our targets page, we're going to target this application to the admin server. If you had clusters defined in your domain, you would see those here as well. But for this lab exercise, let's go ahead and check the box for the admin server and click Next. So this is an important page as well. On this page, we can override the name of the deployment, but we're going to accept the defaults here. The default name for deployment is usually the name of the archive file. Now this can be specified or overridden using a WebLogic deployment descriptor. Underneath that, we can specify the security model for the application. I'll get into this later on in the course when we talk about application security, but just to give you a heads up, Java EE applications can use declarative security using a deployment descriptor, where you define what resources are protected by what roles or users. So when you deploy an application in WebLogic, the default setting is to use this deployment descriptor only model. And that's the first option here, the DD only option. You can, however, override this. So as an administrator, you can override what the developer's done or put in the deployment descriptor. So for instance, a developer usually defines a role that protects a resource in an application, like a URL. However, the developer doesn't define who's in that role. You as an administrator can go into the admin console here and define which users are part of that role. Or you can define your own role altogether and override what's in that deployment descriptor. So for this lab, let's leave DD only checked. And then when we scroll down, recall that I mentioned that there were 3 deployment options, staging options. There was staging, which is the default deployment option where the application is copied to each and every target by the admin server. Then there was no stage or external stage where you as the administrator or some third-party process would actually stage the applications on the target servers or on a shared drive. So each target within WebLogic, whether it's a WebLogic server or a cluster, defines default deployment behavior. In that default is to have application files or deployment files copied to that target. And so that is the same as this next option that says recommended selection and copy this application onto every target for me. So they are one and the same in this case because we have not overridden the default behavior for these deployment targets. But go ahead and check the radio button for copy this application onto every target and scroll down. So this plan source accessibility section is all about deployment plans. And we'll go into deployment plans during the production deployment lecture. Deployment plan allows you to abstract and decouple environment configuration settings from an application into an external XML file. So that when you deploy an application from one environment to the next, and you've got environment specific settings, you don't need to build a new deployment archive for that environment. You can manage those environment changes or differences in this deployment plan. So in this case, accept the defaults for the plan source accessibility and click Next. And this is just the review page for how we're going to deploy this application. So you can see the name of the app, the staging mode, the deployment plan staging mode, and the security model, and where it's being targeted to. So this all looks good. Go ahead and click Finish. Once WebLogic is done deploying that example main web application, it may launch another browser window or tab that will link to the sample web application. So that sample web app has some code in it that automatically launches a browser if the machine that you're deploying on has a browser on it. So that's not normal for when you deploy any other web application. It's just specific to this particular web application. So if you get a 503 error, go ahead and refresh your browser, and the home page for that web application should show up. And so on this screen, you can see that we've got the home page for the WebLogic server example domain. And on this page, there's a bunch of information about features and enhancements and resources that came with WebLogic. So this is the sample application that we're looking at. So if you see this, then you've successfully deployed the application. So let's switch back to the other tab. And on the Summary of Deployments tab, you'll now see the main web app. And you can see in this table, one of the most important attributes here is the state. Active means that the web application is healthy and it's active. It's available to anybody and everybody in the environment. It also shows the server that it's targeted to and its type. This is a web application. It is a WAR file. I can click on the plus sign here, and any modules that are deployed in this web application would show up underneath the application. So if I had any defined web services or EJBs, they would show up underneath main web app. This main web app does not contain any of those, so that's why there's nothing here. In an enterprise application archive, you would certainly see additional components, because an EAR by itself doesn't have an application. Usually an EAR contains one or more WAR files and JAR files, EJBs, and web services. So if we had deployed an EAR file, a real enterprise application, we would have seen additional services under that. So you can actually go ahead and click on this application, and you can review you can see an overview of the application. So we have the name, the context root. So the context root is the URL after the host and port that is used to access this application. When you see no value specified, that means that the root URL is used to access this application. So if we go back and click on the Welcome to WebLogic Server tab, which is our main web app application, and if I click on my address bar, you can see that it's the URL /index.jsp. Well, this is just the default page. Had I backed up here and click enter, you'll see that it just loads the home page here. And then path is the location of the source of the deployment archive. So this is where the application was deployed from. This is not where it's running on the admin server. That's a different directory, and I'll show you that in a second. Deployment plan, we did not specify one. Staging mode is stage, which is the default application. And then security models, DD only, which is deployment descriptor only. So when we selected DD only, which is the default, we cannot override any of the security definitions that are in the deployment descriptor. And then deployment order specifies what order WebLogic should start this application. So if you had several different web applications that were part of several different archive files and they required that they be started in a certain order, you could specify that order here. So scroll up and take a look at the configuration tab. And these are our application specific settings. So there are global settings for session cookies and session timeouts, but you can override them at the application level. And on the security tab, we can define roles and security policies. But as I mentioned, since we're using the DD only security model, then we cannot override any of the roles using the console. And we'll get into this in a later lecture on production deployment and security. So on the targets tab, you can see what servers that the application's targeted to, or clusters. We don't have any clusters defined, so there's nothing here. But if I want to retarget an application, add it to an additional server, move it around to another server or cluster, I can do that here, and I can check the box and click save, and I don't need to redeploy the application. I don't need to undeploy it. WebLogic will automatically handle that for you. So now what I've done is I've added this deployment to the MS1 managed server.